Pianist and conductor Ignat Solzhenitsyn is principal guest conductor of the Moscow Symphony Orchestra and conductor laureate of the Chamber Orchestra of Philadelphia. Ignat has recently led many symphony orchestras both in the United States and in Russia, as well as in Canada, Israel, and Australia. As a piano soloist, he has collaborated with some of the greatest conductors in the world, and he is very active as a chamber musician as well. A winner of the Avery Fisher Grant, Mr. Solzhenitsyn serves on the faculty of the Curtis Institute of Music, or as we here at Colburn refer to it, one of those Eastern schools. He has been featured on many radio and television specials, including CBS Sunday Morning, ABC's Nightline. Born in Moscow, Mr. Solzhenitsyn resides in New York City. And I'm very pleased to welcome to our symposium, speaking on the topic, the Fifth Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich, Revisiting Absolute Music, Historical Memory, and the Concretization of Experience, my old friend and former colleague, Ignat Solzhenitsyn.
Ladies and gentlemen, I will never forget the first time I heard the Fifth Symphony of Dmitri Shostakovich. It was in a perhaps somewhat unlikely location of a summer music camp in the Green Mountains of Vermont, not far from where my family was living in those years of exile. Every week, the student orchestra would present the work that they had been working on, and the repertoire was suitably broad: Schubert, Tchaikovsky, Ravel, Bartók. For an 11-year-old who had been reared in a traditional diet of Bach, Beethoven, and Brahms, there was much to discover and much to wonder at. But nothing prepared me for the electrifying jolt I experienced when, for its final performances of the summer, the orchestra sat down to play Shostakovich's Fifth. I had never heard music like it. I was rooted to my chair, overwhelmed as much by the unbearable poignancy of this music as by its visceral power. Entire galaxies seemed to rise up, then collapse in crimson vortices of chaos. Visions of distant ages and lands passed before my eyes. I lost all track of time and place. Yet at the same time, I felt hyper alert to the unfolding of the music in real time. And I recall how each theme sounded as if I'd heard that performance yesterday. Summer was over, but I could not get over what I had heard. As soon as I next went to New York for lessons, I went to the Old Tower Records in East 4th and bought the Kirill Kondrashin LP of the Fifth, which I proceeded to wear out over what must have been a couple of hundred playings. The irresistible grip the symphony had over me only increased with each encounter. Incidentally, this was hands-on proof for me of the falseness of the maxim that familiarity breeds contempt. At least in the realm of great art, I find just the opposite to be true. Or to put it colloquially, it's funny how Beethoven gets better every year. As my teenage years progressed, I studied and listened to as much Shostakovich as possible. First the other symphonies, then the quartets, the vocal cycles, the operas, the piano music. Shostakovich became almost as essential to my understanding of the world, or at least of myself, as those timeless German masters. I compared recordings of Mravinsky, Svetlanov, Rozhdestinsky. Later, as I moved through the conducting program at the Curtis Institute and into professional life, I began to lead his symphonies myself and to connect with them on an entirely deeper, still more personal level. I came to discuss the music and the man behind the music with Maxim Shostakovich, the composer's son, with Valentin Berlinsky of the Borodin Quartet, Galina Vishnevskaya, and especially with Slava Rostropovich, who shared with me so many stories and memories of the composer and their work together that I almost began to feel as though I was privileged to have known him myself. All of which is to say that the man Ian MacDonald has called the new Shostakovich was, give or take, the only Shostakovich I had known. A keenly intelligent, widely read but painfully shy man, possessed of a turbulent, fiery inner life, at times given to ironic and even sardonic expression, yet deeply decent and careful not to give offense. A man with extraordinary sensitivity to justice, a keen patriot of Russia, but no friend of the Soviet apparatus, displaying an obtuseness sadly typical of its binary Cold War understanding. The New York Times, in its obituary of the composer, described him as a, quote, committed communist, unquote, failing to comprehend the basic but profound distinction between Russian and Soviet. So it was only gradually that I became aware that in the minds of certain predominantly but not exclusively Western listeners, there had apparently existed an old Shostakovich, that committed communist of the Times obituary, an impressive exponent of socialist realism in music, an obedient servant of the Soviet regime, a retrograde composer who could not compete with the true carriers of modernism's flame. So preposterous did this view seem to me that at first I simply brushed it aside. But its persistent prevalence forced me to evaluate it more closely, to delve into its origins, to wonder if there wasn't some truth to it. And for the first time to ask myself the question that animates us at this gathering: how should we perform the troubled past? As I began to deconstruct for myself the edifice of myth surrounding Western perceptions of Shostakovich, the most basic problem turned out to be as intractable as it was painfully familiar: the inability, or in some cases the unwillingness, to understand the murderous nature of the Soviet regime itself and its crucial organizing principle, the prohibition on speaking freely on pain of death. Only such an ignorance, thoughtlessly cruel, inexcusably smug, could explain the inane questions posed to Shostakovich theoretically, or in fact directly during his few public appearances in the West. Tactless questions that a man in his position could not even begin to answer truthfully. Levon Hakobian writes that, quote, Shostakovich's attitude toward Stalin did not differ from that of any other more or less intelligent Soviet citizen. By the late 1960s and 70s, all possible illusions about Stalin and Stalinism had been thoroughly dispelled. Only narrow-minded and detached Western intellectual leaders of the Jean-Paul Sartre type could see in Stalin and in his companions anything but a gang of criminals, unquote. And indeed, this man, Shostakovich, had seen as close up as many, and indeed closer than some, closer than most, I think, the suffocating savagery of Stalin. His own sister Maria and her entire family had been arrested and exiled. His dear friend Marshal Tukhachevsky, himself a very problematic figure to say the least, was arrested and shot. Same with another close friend, the great theater director Meyerhold. Many others. How could such a person, therefore, sincerely support the deeds of the party? And at the same time, how could a man so scarred by fear choose any path but reluctant conformism? After all, Shostakovich himself was publicly shamed and humiliated in 1936 and again in 1948, and made to fear for his own life, going to bed every night with the unbearable expectation of that knock on the door. Of course, in that sense, he was no different from millions of regular Soviet citizens. According to Ian MacDonald, these ordeals, quote, these ordeals humiliating and frightening in a way entirely obscure to people used to be able to answer back, marked the composer for life, unquote. The great soprano, Galina Vishnevskaya, put it this way in her book, quote, he often told us when he erupted over yet another injustice, don't waste your efforts. Work, play. You're living here in this country and you must see everything as it really is. Don't create illusions. There is no other life. There can't be any. Just be thankful that you're still allowed to breathe. And so he made statements in the press and at meetings. He signed letters of protest that, as he himself said, he never read. He didn't worry about what people would say of him because he knew the time would come when the verbiage would fade away, when only his music would remain. Unquote. The next question had to do with wildly divergent opinions on the meaning of Shostakovich's music and the general philosophy of Shostakovich performance. There is no doubt that the major event here was the sensational publication in New York in 1979 of Testimony, claimed by journalist Solomon Volkov to be the memoirs of Dmitri Shostakovich as told to Volkov. Impassioned debate immediately arose with regard to the veracity of Volkov's story and the percentage of testimony that Shostakovich actually said, or at least could have said. Many scholars voiced grave doubts about the book, notably the distinguished Laurel Fay, whose carefully researched article, Whose Testimony, exemplified the skeptical tone taken by many scholars for years to come. Opinions amongst those in Russia who knew Shostakovich well ranged the gamut, from musicologist Lev Lebedynsky, quote, its authenticity is beyond question. It is the truth about Shostakovich. To Shostakovich's student Boris Tishchenko, quote, this is not Shostakovich's memoirs, nor even a book by Volkov about Shostakovich. It is a book by Volkov about Volkov. To the great cellist of the Borodin Quartet, Valentin Berlinsky, already mentioned, quote from him is, the truth obviously lies somewhere in between. Similarly, the editor-in-chief of the new collected works of Shostakovich, Manashir Yakubov, who believed that a proper evaluation of testimony still lies ahead of us. And so, even though the committed communist trope itself had been utterly discredited, for many years there continued to rage what Elizabeth Wilson, in her invaluable history, Shostakovich, A Life Remembered, has called the Shostakovich Wars. I think she coined that term, but if not, then credit to whoever did. The Shostakovich Wars, the battles to dig out the objective truth, if to the extent that was even possible, or if nothing else, to recruit the great composer to one side or another posthumously. While Wilson expresses amazement that the idea of Shostakovich promulgating the official communist line in his music could ever have gained currency at all, she questions testimony as well, for an excellent and subtle reason, that it risks reducing the greatness of Shostakovich's art to the banal level of political statement. Furthermore, she takes issue with interpretations that are too specific. Quote, while the composer's frequent use of quotation and allusion is undeniable, a dangerous problem occurs when the right to the understanding of his work, and not least the decoding of its signals, is claimed exclusively by one or other party. This results in emphasis being placed on secondary issues and overlooks the intrinsic value of the music for its own sake, unquote. Meanwhile, the scholar Malcolm Brown is equally unconvinced by many of the specific interpretations in The New Shostakovich of Ian MacDonald, a book significantly influenced in its own right by the publication of Testimony. Brown writes, quote, such an interpretation amounts to nothing more than a caricature that impoverishes the very nature of art by suggesting that the creative stimulus for an artwork is identical with its artistic realization. How demeaning of the composer's creative aspirations to propose that he reconceptualizes a life experience in musical terms so precise that they retain the empirical specificity of the original incident. So much for the artistic universality of Shostakovich's music, unquote. This is a theme to which we will return. Of course, no single work of Shostakovich exemplifies divergent histories or bifurcated performance practice as much as his most famous symphony, the Fifth. And as I began more and more to conduct this work, so loved since childhood, I felt it unavoidable to try and untangle the complex, competing, contradictory strains of critical and performing tradition that had grown up around the Fifth in order to fight through to a deeper understanding of the music itself. What were these first reactions, the early myths around the piece, created even as it was being rehearsed and performed? What of the furiously contentious discussions that have continued until our own day? And do they inform our judgment, or sometimes retard and actually hinder it, as strikingly suggested by Elizabeth Wilson? The backstory, widely known, of course, is that the young Shostakovich, having electrified the world with his masterful First Symphony at the incomprehensible age of 19, had by age 27 run into major trouble with his second opera, Lady Macbeth of I can never say it in English, Lady Macbeth Mtsenskого Uyezda. In Russian it works. Lady Macbeth of Mtsensk. Doesn't work in English. Which was shut down despite great success at home and abroad, after a virulent editorial in Pravda warned the composer, "This is a game," quote, "that may end very badly," unquote. The terrified composer then withdrew from rehearsals, his Fourth Symphony, another tragedy, and lay low, barely avoiding arrest, until bringing forth then his Fifth Symphony at the very apogee of Stalin's indiscriminate terror in 1937. Well, the atmosphere of suspenseful dread surrounding the premiere and its extraordinary triumph have long since passed into legend. But here are some less well-known details worth parsing. Imagine this surreal scene, Orwellian on so many levels. At a closed session a few weeks after the premiere, Shostakovich repeatedly refuses to explain to his fellow composers, and so it's a session just for the inside folks, to explain to them the meaning of his symphony, pointing out that he had already explained it through these first few public performances of recent weeks. Meanwhile, the young conductor who led them, the previously unknown or barely known Evgeny Muravinsky, presents not only a formal analysis of the work, but certain interpretive decisions that he portrays as bearing the exclusive stamp of the author's approval. How did he reach those decisions? Well, by tricking the composer. And here Muravinsky himself, in public, describes how he would play the wrong tempi on purpose in order to draw out corrections and guidance from Shostakovich. Effective, perhaps, but ethically problematic. And where is Shostakovich while this extraordinary relation is taking place? Well, he's seated behind the piano to illustrate the musical examples used by Muravinsky in his lecture. Meanwhile, not only did Shostakovich repeatedly refuse to elaborate on the meaning of the Fifth, but it turns out that he never authored that labored, odious subtitle, quote, you all know it, "The practical, creative answer of a Soviet artist to just criticism," unquote. It was only his passing and passive acknowledgement of an unknown critic's remark that grew, in the words of Laurel Fay, into, quote, one of the most enduring myths about Shostakovich. He neither affixed nor endorsed any subtitle to the Fifth, nor does any appear, of course, in the published score, unquote. As for the legendary premiere itself, on 21st November 1937, one ear witness after another struggles to bring across to us an adequately complete picture of what was clearly an experience of remarkable intensity and catharsis. One recalled that people cried openly during the Largo. Another how, quote, many of the listeners started to rise automatically from their seats during the finale, one after the other. The music had a sort of electrical force. A thunderous ovation shook the columns of the White Philharmonic Hall, and Evgeny Muravinsky lifted the score high above his head. And how's this little-known detail? Isaac Glickman, very close friend of Shostakovich, recalls the testimony of the distinguished philologist Vladimir Shishmaryov, who told him that only once before had he experienced a similar emotion and witnessed such a triumph at the premiere of Tchaikovsky's Pathetique Symphony in the same hall in 1893. As they say, chew on that. According to numerous accounts, the ovation lasted over half an hour. Mstislav Rostropovich would later reflect, the government would have been delighted to execute Shostakovich, but They had never seen such an audience success. So they put a brave face on it, saying, we've taught him, and now he's writing acceptable music. A priceless side note here, in classic Soviet style, this sensational success of the Fifth immediately caused officials in the party bureaucracy to investigate how could this happen and whose fault is it. 2 functionaries reported back to Moscow, went to Leningrad, came back, that the hall must have been artificially stacked with friends and sympathizers of the composer, although it was demonstrably true that tickets were sold through the box office openly as for any other concert. Well, as time went on, a multitude of interpretations of the Fifth were proposed, of course, by performers, critics, and indeed audiences, including those silly notions of an artist's response to just criticism, or that idea of Shostakovich learning from his sins and now writing music in line with socialist realism. It is curious today to read in Fay's book the mixed comments from the likes of Selyartinsky, Miskovsky, and Mandelstam, all great artists, to be sure. As for ordinary Russians, MacDonald writes, quote, that the communist reaction the Fifth seems to have called forth from contemporary Russian listeners was simple relief at hearing tragic emotion expressed during a time when genuine feeling was being systematically destroyed by the terror. Galina von Meck, in a passage on the effect of hearing music in the labor camps, describes a radio broadcast of the Fifth in just such generalized terms, that the music's emotion was, to her as to others, evidently authentic. And in an era of enforced artificiality, that in itself was almost unbearably moving, unquote. Echoing this theme, also the distinguished musicologist Maria Sabinina, author of the first major study of Shostakovich symphonies, said in 1992 that she now perceived the Largo of the Fifth to be a requiem for the millions innocent victims of Stalin's regime. Of course, the entire idea of a tragic interpretation of the Fifth is at odds with the persistent strain of thought that predictably understandably equates the fortissimo D major in the coda of the finale with an optimistic, not to say bland, resolution of the symphony's argument. The classic exponent of this gung-ho view was Leonard Bernstein, whose famous Columbia Records version ends with a dizzying, festive romp. I must confess that I simply did not believe my ears when I first heard the speed of that coda. Having myself grown up on Kondrashin and Mravinsky and live performances of Rostropovich, it seemed inconceivable, a vulgar joke, akin to the way one could jack up the speed of an LP player, remember that? To produce a comically nonsensical deformation of a recording. Then, even more incredible to read in Sofia Hentova's biography, that Shostakovich, that's the approved Soviet biography, by the way, that Shostakovich once referred approvingly to Bernstein's version, though perhaps it was really a case of being damned by faint praise, which Shostakovich did a lot. He wrote that he, quote, liked it that Bernstein played the end of the finale significantly faster than is customary. This from the man who was memorably quoted in testimony, so we don't know for sure, but one of the famous passages and sounds right, as saying, quote, I never thought about any exultant finales, for what exultation could there be? I think that it is clear to everyone what happens in the Fifth. The rejoicing is forced, created under threat, as in Boris Godunov. It's as if someone were beating you with a stick and saying, your business is rejoicing, your business is rejoicing. And you rise shaky and go marching off, muttering, our business is rejoicing, our business is rejoicing. What kind of apotheosis is that? You have to be a complete oaf not to hear that, unquote. How could such a profound dichotomy arise? How could such diametrically opposite interpretations of the same passage be held with such conviction by serious musicians? After the din of rancorous decades of debate on this topic, I modestly propose that we performers remind ourselves subjective traditions are one thing, but objective facts of the score, The actual decisions fixed by a composer on paper are quite another. I'm referring here to nothing more than the coda's metronome mark, printed as 188 to the quarter in the first 1939 edition, changed to half that speed in the 47 and 56 editions, and then changed back again in a later edition. The preponderance of evidence has certainly long favored the slow version. But my point is that what has sometimes been lost in musicologists and critics' parsing of subtext and allegory with respect to the meaning of the end is that no decision performers make matters, of course, more than tempo. And in the case of such an extreme difference, half the speed or double the speed, it is not at all surprising that those conductors who read the slow marking would tend to the forced rejoicing view, inevitably emphasizing the repeated pounding high A's in the violins and those bone-jarring dissonances of the brass clusters, while those who chose the fast version, or choose the fast version, would end up with the optimistic scenario a la Bernstein and Ormandy, accentuating the reassuring major progressions and regular phrase lengths that become far more obvious at their tempo. Parenthetically, I myself was destined to play a small role, a kind of postscript in this story. In late 2003, I had stopped by the Shostakovich Center on Olsufyevsky Street in Moscow to pick up the latest volumes in their ongoing new collected works, and I saw lying on the table galley proofs of the Fifth Symphony. How wonderful, I thought, and I immediately leafed through to the coda page, anticipating the immense satisfaction of finally seeing the correct metronome mark restored to its original place. Imagine my shock when I saw that same accursed quarter equals 188, like Banquo's ghost stubbornly refusing to be dislodged. In dismay, I phoned Manashir Yakubov, the chief editor, but was met with a reassuring disbelief. It turns out he had not only corrected this metronome mark, but had prepared commentary for the critical notes accompanying this volume, specifically addressing this issue. And so how the pernicious quarter note crept back in there and was stopped there in the last moment there at the galley stage must remain a matter for connoisseurs of the coincidence versus fate argument. But it is there now. The slow tempo is in the Urtext best edition now. So it remains that conductors and performers are left to grapple with stark choices, not only in this coda passage, but throughout this great symphony, and indeed throughout Shostakovich's output at large. How concrete is the experience that we seek to convey? And is that even the right question? Many imply that it is. The widow of the composer, Irina Shostakovich, speaks of his quartets as diary. The composer himself, if testimony is to be believed, suggests that, quote, the word is more effective than music. Unfortunately, it's so. When I combine music with words, it becomes harder to misinterpret my intent, unquote. The critic Alex Ross, whom we all look forward to hearing this afternoon, proposes in his essential book, The Rest is Noise, that music of the 20th century cannot be fenced off from society. It is not self-sufficient. Music cannot achieve total autonomy from the society around it, he says. In so saying, Ross at least belies the claim of Maria Sabinina that Westerners, quote, tend to interpret Shostakovich's music as pure music, isolated from its social historical context. Ian MacDonald, too, avers that Shostakovich's art is simply unintelligible when taken out of socio-historical context, and that appreciating his music just as pure music is limply inane. Slava Rostropovich himself, maybe the contemporary interpreter closest to Shostakovich, suggests that he personifies an entire epoch in the life of this planet. Otherwise, people throughout the whole world would not listen to his music so much. Yet many of the same people concede that Shostakovich's music cannot quite be bound by the limits of the harrowing crucible in which it was born. If it has profound intrinsic merit, and surely it does, then its power will hardly diminish as the context fades. In contradiction to Rostropovich, my great friend and mentor, if people around the world would not listen and respond to his music as strongly as they do. It would likely be precisely if it had been too bound up with its specific context. Shostakovich was famously reluctant to discuss his music, as mentioned earlier. According to testimony, I don't need brave words, I need brave music. Ian MacDonald, notorious for adducing the precisest of specificity to one passage after another in this music, postulates that Shostakovich is more concerned with spiritual values and communicates in a more universal plane than many a composer customarily thought to be his superior, unquote. In fact, he provocatively adds about the Fifth Symphony, quote, insofar as it speaks not merely for Russia in 1937, but for hundreds of millions of others in the 20th century who have suffered under political oppression. It is actually more universal than, say, Tchaikovsky's Sixth, which, while generally loved, speaks primarily for Tchaikovsky. We turn again to Alex Ross. Shostakovich was neither saint nor devil. Like other composers under totalitarian regimes, he was, quote, a flawed actor on a tilted stage. Shostakovich speaks for all, unquote. Speaking more broadly, Ross insightfully suggests that history can never tell us exactly what music means, but music can tell us something about history. Music may not be inviolable, but it is infinitely variable, Ross goes on to say, acquiring a new identity in the mind of every new listener. It is always in the world, neither guilty nor innocent, subject to the ever-changing human landscape in which it moves. And so isn't that the whole point? As performers, we must in the end move beyond context and allow the truth of the music, the ever-elusive thing in itself, to be revealed. When my friend Philip Zetzer of the Emerson Quartet says that, quote, by the end of the Fifth Symphony, I'm just torn to shreds. And I felt that as a kid, without reading anything or knowing anything about Shostakovich. That resonates powerfully with my own first reaction to the Fifth, those many summers ago, when, unburdened by analysis and specificity, I was transported to an undiscovered country, the path to which is always in front of us, yet ever shrouded in mystery. Thank you.
Questions? Yes, sir. Over there.
Well, yeah, it's a brilliant talk, and I hope it gets published in the New Yorker or something. I would like to ask you, if I was tactless in 1970, when Aram Khachaturian came to Los Angeles, and I attended a press conference, and I asked him for his opinion on the Solzhenitsyn affair. Mm-hmm. Maybe I was tactless, but his answer was very interesting. He said, we can talk later over cognac.
Well, that alone might be interpreted as a brave answer. I would remind you that, and you know this, I'm sure, that 1970, of course, is not the same as 1949, when Shostakovich came to the World Peace Congress in New York. And yes, the era of Solzhenitsyn and Sakharov was difficult, but it was not quite the mad insanity, the lunacy of Stalin's period. So, and we know that in Shostakovich's own life. Many have very fairly asked why at that stage in his life, with his reputation and fame at its highest peak in the 1960s and into the 70s, at a time when there had been some kind of a bit of a thaw in under Khrushchev, and even Brezhnev's regime was not quite the villainous nightmare of Lenin's and Stalin's years. Why did Shostakovich sign those letters or sign those petitions? Why did he participate in the line? It's a It's a fair question that I tried to address a little bit in the time we had. Much more to talk about it, of course. Much more that can be said about it, but it's a fair question. But I think we have to keep in mind before we judge too harshly what Shostakovich and others had been through in the 30s and in the 40s. It's a different category of fear, perhaps.
Yes, Neil.
Would you agree that testimony was pivotal in changing the West's, especially Americans' perceptions about Shostakovich, and that when he wrote in testimony, even though some would say he's a fraud, and in Laurel Face Camp is also Richard Cheruskin, who we can beat up on more since he's not here today. That so much of what Shostakovich was trying to say in music was encoded criticisms and hatred of the regime, even though he was looked at as a Soviet stooge by Americans, and the quote in the New York Times that you had mentioned also for so long. So it seems to me that book really kind of changed the way the West, especially the United States, looked at this important composer. Do you agree?
In short, yes, I do agree. Having said that, I mean, the book is problematic. I think maybe Yakubov is right. Maybe a full evaluation is still to come. Nobody's seen the original papers, and the book, of course, doesn't exist in Russian. The book only exists in English. It may be that a time will still come, but broadly speaking, you're absolutely right. The problem I think that we run into with testimony is that the level of detail adduced to specific. I just reminded you of that famous one about the Coda of the Fifth, but there is detail like this about many passages, which in other pieces strikes one as perhaps being less likely to be authentic. And then, of course, that large percentage of or significant percentage of the book that's sort of gossipy, and that's not very friendly or not very just polite to many fellow composers, musicians, artists, and so forth. Doesn't strike people who knew him as likely. Certainly that in any kind of, I mean, we all say things in private, obviously, but that he would say things so vulgar and mean for public consumption. For okay, after my death, go ahead and I don't care. Publish. Well, his family, his daughter, his son, his wife, his widow. It seems unlikely. So testimony, of course, has many problems, but the fact that its publication was absolutely, you're right, was essential in changing how people in the West understood whom they understood Shostakovich to be.
Mike?
Yeah, one thing you didn't mention of scholars who's just written a very interesting book is Marina Frolova-Walker, who just wrote a book about the Stalin Prize. And it's a revelation in its own right because it shows a completely different side. Stalin shows up probably better prepared than anybody else around the table. It's not always his opinion that wins out. Other people argue with him in ways that we would have thought would be impossible. And so that's my comment, that there's more ambiguity in this time period than, I understand your encapsulation of it, and most of us would agree emotionally. This was a time of bestiality, this was a time of horror, and yet, you have this record of all these artists debating with Stalin in a way that seems unlikely considering that. So I guess my question is, since you began with this notion from your childhood of this wholehearted endorsement of a certain Shostakovich, and then your gradual exploration of another Shostakovich, that leaves us with a sense of ambiguity. And I guess I want to ask the difficult question of how does a performer, can a performer, and how does a performer use ambiguity? Is it a destabilizing thing, potentially make it difficult, or do you feel that there are ways that you're able to use it as a performer to do things that you hadn't even thought about with a piece?
I think it presents a challenge, and it's a stimulating factor towards more careful study, towards more questioning of one's interpretation and the picture that is being presented. Probably in any composer, not just in Shostakovich, the more reason, whatever those external reasons for ambiguities may be, sometimes internal reasons in the score, that presents a challenge, but I don't know that it's that I wouldn't prefer to interpret music where the meaning to me, at least, seems entirely clear. With respect to our evaluation of Shostakovich, the man, this has to remain an open question. What's unacceptable, I think, in light of everything some of the things I mentioned today and many other things widely known now, it's unacceptable and just silly to suggest that Shostakovich that actually any great artist could be a kind of you said stooge, someone who fulfills party orders. Musicians or artists of that nature, I don't think reach heights like Shostakovich. Obviously, that may be open to debate. But that doesn't mean that he behaved in the most honorable way and that he did not make, in other words, many people feel he could have been braver, and I understand that point of view. My own father felt that way, that Shostakovich could have been, he wished Shostakovich could have been braver. For example, after the invasion of Czechoslovakia. A perfect opportunity to stand up and say, I'm ashamed of my country. But my father also understood Shostakovich did not have that fight in him anymore. And I think that's something. With respect to the Stalin, I mean, I would just, that's an interesting point you raised. Stalin, of course, was quite well read, had a decent ear with respect to music. People have said that about Hitler as well, that he had some, probably not quite, as much as Stalin, but nonetheless that Hitler was able to, or thought himself able to distinguish and judge art. And Stalin certainly had those pretensions. And he loved the cat and mouse game of who's up and who's down, with major composers and figures of art, as well as with functionaries, who is now helping him decide, who is now sort of in temporary or permanent banishment. So I think some of those details are, they're fascinating, but I think they're, in a sense, give us an even more lurid portrayal of the that really all these puppets were dancing, allowed to express to a certain extent their opinion, but all under the tutelage, under the watch of the master puppeteer.
You've had extraordinary access to people who were very close to the composer over the years. And so you have a very unusual way into the evidence about the compositions. A number of years ago, I programmed the Shostakovich concert and had some contact with a family member. And it was I was of course not an insider in that circle. And I found the response quite, what's the word, obfuscatory maybe? It wasn't, it was understandable. This was in the late 80s. And I thought it was interesting.
What year specifically do you recall? Do you recall the specific year by chance? Because 80s, 80.
About 1990.
Okay.
89, 90.
It's different from 87, let's say.
Yes.
Okay. Right, such a.
Yeah, sure. And I wondered, whether I was still dealing with a situation where there was some concern about what should be said because of the relationship of family members to that regime and all of that. Anyway, the question is, since you're somebody who now works in Russia today, I'm wondering whether that the political situation there now allows for a more open discussion of these matters, or if there's still, you know, a kind of haze over these kinds of discussions that has to do not only with what happened then, but with what's going on now.
Excellent question. And the short answer is there is great freedom to discuss the past, but not full. Not full freedom. Because, for example, the archives that were opened up briefly, really to any comer, more or less, sign in, show your ID and go in from the west, from the east, from the north, anywhere. During a part of the Yeltsin years, that was shut down pretty quickly. And you know, maybe some people say it had to be done, it was too open from a national security point of view, leaving aside all the contentious issues we're talking about. But in any case, now it's again much more difficult, not like in the Soviet times, when if you ask to see the archives, you go to the Gulag, right? So it's not, we mustn't even think about equating, but there are certain, it's much more difficult. You have to fill out long forms, why, what's your work, what's your purpose, how will you use it, et cetera, et cetera. So it has become more difficult. But in terms of the atmosphere of discussion, it's widely free, particularly outside of television, where in television, which is largely, as you know, state-controlled, there's more, greater limits on what is likely to be said. But in the internet, in the newspapers, and certainly in, let's not forget, just an open, casual, kind of private and even public conversation like this, there's anything goes. So that's good. But yes, the more of it, the better.
I wanted to thank you, Ignat, for all of this. I wanted to take several strands, some from yesterday and the discussion of pre-performance talks. Because I love the Shostakovich Fifth the way you do, and I do it a lot, and in America, I always give from the podium a talk that actually plays on the ambiguity. I mean, issue, if there's ambiguity, what do you do with it as a performer? Well, I have my own credo about that. You perform the piece, and the ambiguity will be evident or not evident to everybody hearing it. But because this symphony has all these backstories, the palpably false one of the great triumph of the positive view of the future, but the darker side has been posited, has been discussed. There are so many stories about what does this mean, but you really still can't be sure what it means. And then, when you're all through with that triumph at the end, or as Shostakovich said, it's like the populace being beaten, like the populace in Boris Godunov. Then there's a whole other story, which has some currency, has a great deal of currency, that this is actually, there's a great deal of a private love story of Shostakovich, and I was interested that you did not mention it in this context, but there's an enormous amount of internal evidence that Bizet's Carmen is playing a role in a lot of the thematic motives of this, and that all has to do with a woman he loved who abandoned him for a man whose name was Carmen. All of that together, and I tell the whole story to the audience as if to say, in the end, it's a great masterpiece because it's a great masterpiece, and you can, some of it, you can believe this, you can believe that, you can believe none of it, but you can also believe all of it, and we actually don't know, and we probably never will know, and to use that ambiguity to present the ambiguity, given that Shostakovich, from that piece on, wrote in code. And so there's code in that. Well, I wasn't really asking a question, but I just wanted to share that because of yesterday's conversation about do you put the audience in a certain direction or do you not? Because I still find that the majority of I don't know if it's a majority, but many, many people in America are still laboring under that absolute false view of Shostakovich that we all heard that. I mean, at my student years, that was just said, yes, the man is a great composer, but his music is serving the enemy, which of course more false. And I too had so much contact with Slava over the years that, of course, that was corrected from inside. Just so the only short question is, what do you think, if anything, of the entire story of the love affair of Lala, which explains some things in this?
I think it's undoubtedly true. I just don't know how much. So I buy it, hook, line, and sinker. I just don't know how much it adds. I think it adds an element. It adds an element to these weighted and weighty factors on all sides of the Fifth. But I think, echoing something else you said, I would welcome, in general, an ability to perform and to hear and to write about Shostakovich, perhaps increasingly in a way that becomes liberated from this crushing, one way or the other, crushing historical context, and allows us to engage with his music in the same way, which, with very few exceptions, we engage with other music, even of the 20th century, and certainly music going back. If Shostakovich has to be a prisoner only of this constant, these wars and these constant battles, what does it mean? What does it mean? What does this bar mean? What does this bar mean? What does this symphony mean? What does that symphony mean? Then his music cannot be, in my opinion, its measure cannot be properly taken. So I hope that we continue to discuss and to argue and to learn and to read and to, but ultimately I hope we're moving to a more of a bird's eye view.
And time is short, I realize, could you, the other person I think we always think about is Prokofiev in this story. And while there are similarities between the story of Prokofiev and Shostakovich, could you perhaps talk about the differences in their experiences with Stalin and music production today?
Prokofiev, first of all, he died famously on the same day as the day we think Stalin died, March 5th. That must remain shrouded somewhat still in controversy, but probably he died on the 5th, and we know Prokofiev died on the 5th. So he did not know a life after Stalin. That's a big difference. As already mentioned, the fairest, the least unfair criticism of Shostakovich's public stance on, as they say, on issues, but would be in the post-Stalin years. Secondly, Prokofiev, of course, had a rich and complex, not always happy career in the West. But he brought back to Russia with him that perspective, which I think informed very much how he viewed the world, how he viewed his position. Why he went back is another enduring mystery. Obviously, we have heard many theories, but it's in the big picture, it's almost impossible to understand why one would miss one's homeland. That I can understand very well. But why one would, having left at the right time, 1917, talking about Schoenberg leaving in 1933, there was sort of a logical time to leave, or an only time to leave, and then to return in the mid-30s. on the verge, in the middle of everything that was happening, and on the verge of even more, is extraordinary. But also, Prokofiev being a Christian Scientist and having that aspect of his life that, you know, I think allowed him to abstract himself a bit from reality and to say, you know, this isn't any of my concern. I don't think Shostakovich ever felt that. And that's why Shostakovich would have felt ashamed, would have felt cowardly at times, would have felt emasculated, powerless. But very, very different personalities. And of course, we hear that in the music, but Prokofiev, I think, had less compunction about. By the way, I'm of course an adoring a fan of Prokofiev, and he is central also to my my repertoire. But he had less compunction about writing, celebrating Stalin's birthday, and writing some of those pieces that one wishes he hadn't.
One last question.
It's not a question, it's
Just a last comment, that's fine.
just a very quick comment. There was a play that I saw in Los Angeles maybe 30 years ago about the dynamics between Shostakovich, Prokofiev, Stalin, and Zhdanov. And I don't remember the name of the play or who wrote it, but it was fascinating. It was in a small theater in Los Angeles. Are you familiar with this?
I'm not. Zhdanov, of course, the author or the I wouldn't say the executor of the 1948 show trials of Khachaturian and Prokofiev and Miskovsky and Shostakovich. But no, I don't. Does anybody know the title or the author? I've not heard of this. And it was.
All right.
Sounds good.
Ignat Solzhenitsyn, thank you very, very much.